I had barely reached the gate when the words sliced through the air behind me. "I hope this plane crashes." My father's voice, deep and deliberate, landed on my skin like shards of glass. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew that tone, that coldness that had marked every stage of my life. It wasn't a joke, not a slip of the tongue. It was a wish, a curse spoken as casually as someone might ask for more sugar in their coffee. My heart dropped. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I wondered if anyone else had heard him, if someone would gasp or confront him. But the world kept moving, oblivious. I stood there, frozen, until the boarding line pushed me forward, as though fate itself demanded I walk into the belly of the metal beast. My legs felt like they were made of lead, every step pulling me deeper into a reality I wished I could wake from. Who says that to their child? What kind of father hopes for his daughter's death, and so brazenly, as if he had been waiting for this moment? I imagined his face, stone-like, unflinching, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of having the last word. My mother would have been beside him, silent as always, her lips pressed together in that thin line that meant agreement disguised as indifference. And Daniel, my brother, probably somewhere smug, enjoying the fact that I was once again the scapegoat. Their voices, their shadows, their contempt pressed down on me so heavily that even the air seemed harder to breathe. I didn't dare glance back. If I looked, I might crumble. If I looked, I might see their eyes filled not with regret, but with vindication, and that would shatter whatever fragile thread of dignity I had left. Instead, I clutched my boarding pass as though it were a shield, gripping it until the edges bit into my palm. The agent smiled and scanned it without noticing the storm raging inside me. Beyond the gate, the jet bridge stretched long and narrow, a tunnel of silence where my father's words echoed louder with every step. "I hope this plane crashes." I repeated it in my head, not because I wanted to, but because it had carved itself into my mind like fire etching into wood. Inside the cabin, I was greeted with the sterile scent of recycled air and the mechanical smiles of flight attendants who guided me toward my seat. People around me were chatting, laughing, adjusting their bags, as though life was perfectly ordinary. For them, maybe it was. For me, it felt like I was walking into a coffin, not because of the plane itself, but because I carried with me the weight of my parents' curse. When I sank into the seat by the window, the leather cold against my back, I pressed my forehead to the glass and exhaled. The airport lights blurred into streaks, and for a moment I wished I could melt into that blur and disappear. I wanted to cry, but the tears refused to fall. It wasn't the kind of pain that found release in tears. It was the kind that hollowed you out from the inside, the kind that left you numb and trembling. My hands shook as I fumbled with the seatbelt, and I caught my reflection in the small oval window. Pale skin, tired eyes, lips pressed into a trembling line. I looked like a stranger even to myself. I had always carried myself with strength, the kind born from years of neglect. But at that moment I felt reduced, small, as though I were still the unwanted child hiding in her room, waiting for the shouting to stop. The engines hummed in the distance, a low vibration that reminded me the moment of takeoff was approaching. With every second, dread coiled tighter around my chest. My father's words were no longer just cruel. They felt prophetic, as though he had summoned something into existence. I tried to shake the thought, telling myself it was only superstition, but the unease crawled deeper, spreading like ink in water. Around me, passengers laughed and typed on their phones, oblivious to the weight pressing me down. I envied them. They had families waving goodbye with love in their eyes. Mine had offered me a curse. Memories surged without warning, fragments of a childhood defined by rejection. I remembered birthdays where Daniel's gifts towered on the table while mine were small and perfunctory. I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he told me not to expect too much, because resources were meant for my brother's future. I remembered my mother's silence, her refusal to defend me, her eyes darting away as if my pain were an inconvenience. Each memory stacked upon the other until the truth was undeniable. This curse wasn't new. It was simply the culmination of a lifetime of disdain, condensed into one final, unforgettable sentence. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, warm and confident, announcing a smooth flight ahead. His tone was reassuring, but it didn't reach me. My father's words had rooted themselves too deeply to be soothed by protocol. As the cabin prepared for takeoff, I pressed my hands together in my lap, trying to ground myself. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and I whispered under my breath, "You will not break me." I wasn't sure if I meant it for the turbulence I feared, or for the parents who had already shattered so much of me. Either way, I had no choice but to face both. The plane began to roll, vibrations shivering through the cabin, pulling us toward the sky. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of everything: my parents' cruelty, my brother's smirk, the cold silence of my mother, the curse that clung to my name like a shadow. As we tilted upward, leaving the earth behind, I gripped the armrest until my knuckles turned white. The ground fell away, the engines roared, and still the words lingered. "I hope this plane crashes." They weren't just words anymore. They had become a challenge, a haunting, and perhaps, though I didn't know it yet, the beginning of something I could no longer run from. When I think back to my childhood, I see shadows more than faces, silence more than words. Gerald, my father, was a man of few but heavy sentences, each one designed to cut or command. Marianne, my mother, floated around the house like a ghost, present but never warm, her eyes sliding past me as if my existence was a mild inconvenience. Daniel, on the other hand, was the sun in their sky. He didn't have to shine. Their gaze turned him golden no matter what he did. He was the favored child, the chosen one, the heir to everything they considered worth passing down. And me? I was the afterthought, the spare piece on a board where the game had already been decided. The favoritism wasn't always obvious to outsiders, but to me, it was suffocating. At Christmas, Daniel's presents spilled across the floor, wrapped in shiny paper with ribbons that curled perfectly. Mine were few, wrapped carelessly, as if the effort wasn't worth the trouble. At school events, my father's booming laugh would echo when Daniel stumbled through a line in a play, proud as though he had conquered the world. When I brought home perfect grades, the response was silence, or worse, a cold acknowledgement, followed by a reminder not to boast. Love, in my home, wasn't earned by merit. It was bestowed by favoritism, and I was never the recipient. I learned early how to become invisible, how to shrink myself so as not to upset the delicate balance of their preferences. When Daniel threw tantrums, he was excused. "He's just spirited," my mother would say with a weary smile. If I so much as questioned something, I was labeled difficult, ungrateful, a burden. The message was clear. My brother's flaws were quirks, but my needs were crimes. I stopped asking for help with homework, stopped inviting them to school events, stopped hoping they would show up for me. Their absence became my constant companion, and eventually, I wrapped it around me like armor. But the cruelest moments were the subtle ones, the ones that couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding. The extra slice of cake quietly slid onto Daniel's plate, the photo albums with pages filled by his milestones while mine were left blank. The way Gerald would clap a hand on his shoulder, pride radiating, while his hand barely brushed mine in passing. It wasn't just neglect, it was erasure. They were writing a family story where I was little more than a footnote, a name in the margins. And the more they ignored me, the harder I worked to exist. My hunger for freedom began there, in those quiet voids of affection. I dreamed of escape before I even knew what escape meant. As a child, I would press my face against the window at night, watching the streetlights flicker, wondering if somewhere out there a girl like me was being hugged goodnight, was being told she mattered. I told myself that one day, I would leave and never look back, that I would build a life where I didn't have to beg to be seen. Even then, my spirit was whispering, "Survive, because they will not love you." That whisper became my lifeline. The more Daniel flourished under their worship, the more I sharpened my independence. I got my first job as soon as I could, not because I needed the money, but because I needed proof that I could sustain myself without them. I worked late, studied harder, carved a space in the world that belonged only to me. Every achievement was a rebellion, every step forward a middle finger to the invisible chains they tried to tie around me. And still, no matter how far I climbed, I carried the wound of their rejection like a stone in my chest. Daniel grew entitled, accustomed to being carried, while I learned the opposite, that the only person I could rely on was myself. When he failed a class, tutors were hired. When I excelled, silence. When he crashed my father's car, it was laughed off as boys being boys. When I so much as spilled a glass of milk, the sharpness of my father's glare cut through me. The rules bent for him, but for me, they pressed down like a weight designed to break me. And yet, in that breaking, I discovered strength, a strength born of necessity, forged in coldness, refined in solitude. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, I would imagine what it would feel like to be loved the way Daniel was, to be seen, celebrated, forgiven. But then the fantasy would collapse under the weight of reality, and I would tell myself that love wasn't for me, not in this family. What I had was survival, and that would have to be enough. Their rejection taught me one lesson I carried into adulthood. I could endure being unwanted, but I would never allow it to define me. And maybe that was why my father's words at the gate, that brutal curse, had pierced me so deeply, because it wasn't just the wish for my death. It was confirmation that to them, I had never been worth keeping alive. The plane hummed with that low mechanical vibration that seems to live inside your bones, but my body was trembling for an entirely different reason. I slid into my seat by the window, pressed against the cool plastic wall, wishing I could vanish into it. And then he arrived. A man, maybe in his 30s, with soft brown eyes that caught mine with disarming steadiness. He placed his bag overhead, sat down beside me, and offered a small nod that was both polite and oddly grounding. For a moment I wanted to ignore him, to build a wall of silence between us, but his presence was impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just that he was there, it was the way he looked at me, as if he already knew I was breaking inside. He introduced himself as Ethan, his voice calm and unhurried, like waves lapping gently at a shore. I murmured my name in return, my voice a brittle whisper that barely carried above the noise of boarding passengers. Most people would have left it at that, but Ethan didn't. He studied me, not in a predatory way, but in a way that felt almost dangerous in its accuracy, as though he could read what others had ignored my whole life. "Rough day?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes searching mine for the truth. I stiffened, torn between lying and confessing, between hiding the wound and letting it bleed out. I gave him fragments, scattered pieces, carefully chosen. "Family stuff," I muttered, staring at my hands twisted in my lap. He didn't press with questions, not directly, but he lingered with the kind of silence that demands filling. Finally, I admitted, they didn't exactly wish me well before I got on this plane. I waited for disbelief, for judgment, but instead he nodded, slow and deliberate, as though he had already guessed. "Sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones who hurt us the most," he said softly. The words sank into me, unsettling because they fit so perfectly. What unsettled me even more was how his voice seemed to echo things I'd thought in secret for years, things I'd never dared to say out loud. It was as if he'd stolen them from the private chambers of my mind. His empathy was sharp, almost surgical, and it frightened me. No one had ever looked at me like that before, with recognition, not pity. I wanted to push him away, to shield myself from being seen too clearly, yet part of me leaned toward him, desperate to rest in that understanding. "You look like someone who's carried weight for too long," he said. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. How could he know? The plane lifted, the city shrinking below, and with it my ability to hide. I found myself speaking in fragments again, about Daniel, about the way my parents had always chosen him, about the curse my father spat at me just hours ago. The words spilled like leaks in a dam, not the full flood, but enough to show how close I was to drowning. Ethan listened without flinching, his gaze steady, his body angled toward me as though he could hold the words in place so they wouldn't crush me. And when I paused, he simply said, "That's not your burden to carry forever." Simple words, but they hit like thunder in my chest. Yet beneath his kindness, something felt uncanny. His eyes lingered on me too long, his insight cutting too close to bone. Strangers don't usually guess the exact shape of your pain, but Ethan did. I wondered if I should be suspicious, if maybe I was being lulled into a dangerous vulnerability, but then he smiled. Not smug, not false, just quiet, almost sad. That smile disarmed me in ways I couldn't explain. "You're not alone, Alexia," he said. And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a lie. They wrapped around me like a thread of warmth I hadn't known I craved. I wanted to believe him, but my mind kept circling back to the strangeness of it all. Who was Ethan, really? A man with kind eyes and an uncanny sense of perception, or something more. His presence soothed me, but also raised questions I couldn't name. How could someone I just met seem to know the ache of my childhood, the sharpness of my father's curse, as if he had been sitting at my family's table all along? I stared out the window, the clouds like endless fields of white below us, and felt both comforted and unsettled. In that suspended space, thousands of feet above the earth, I realized something frightening. I wanted to trust him. I wanted to hand him the truth I had guarded all my life, to let someone else carry it for a moment, even if it broke me to admit. And yet, the nagging voice inside me whispered caution, because people don't just appear in your life at the exact moment you're falling apart without reason. I glanced at Ethan again, and though his face was gentle, there was something unreadable in his eyes, something that promised he knew more than he let on. The first jolt came without warning, a violent shudder that rattled the overhead bins and made my stomach lurch as if it had been ripped from my body. Gasps filled the cabin, and somewhere behind me, a child began to cry. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the armrests, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then, like venom, my father's words came rushing back. "I hope this plane crashes." They echoed with such clarity I almost turned to see if he was sitting behind me, smiling at the thought. The walls of the plane seemed to close in, and I felt as though the curse he cast was unfolding right here in the sky. Another shudder, more violent than the first, sent the plane dipping before it corrected itself. I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thin, like I was suffocating, trapped inside both the metal tube and my own spiraling mind. My nails dug into the seat's fabric as I whispered a prayer I wasn't sure anyone was listening to. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His hand, warm and steady, rested over mine. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice like an anchor in the storm. But how could I believe that, when the weight of my father's curse felt heavier than gravity itself? Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. "You think his words have power, don't you?" The question startled me, as though he had read my thoughts before I even formed them. My lips trembled as I nodded, ashamed of how much control those words still held over me. "I know what it's like to carry someone else's cruelty as though it were your own fate," he said. And for a fleeting moment, the fear cracked enough for me to hear him. His eyes weren't just kind. They carried their own shadows, as though he was speaking from a place carved by his own pain. The turbulence lessened, but my heart was still sprinting in my chest. How could he say that? I whispered, almost to myself. Ethan's jaw tightened, as though my father's words had been spoken directly to him. "Because people like that mistake destruction for power," he replied. "They think if they curse you, they control you, but they don't. Not unless you let them." His conviction startled me. It was as if he knew the precise battle raging inside me, the tug of war between believing in freedom and drowning in the poison of my parents' voices. As the plane steadied, Ethan began to share a story of his own. His words unfolded carefully, like something he hadn't revealed to many people. He spoke of his father, a man who drank too much and loved too little, a man who had once told Ethan that he would never be more than a failure in someone else's shadow. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, yet tinged with old wounds, made me ache for him in a way I hadn't expected. It was unsettling and comforting at once, hearing someone else put their pain on the table so close to mine. I looked at him then, really looked. There was no pity in his eyes, no smugness in revealing his story to draw mine out, only a quiet recognition, as if he knew the landscape of rejection too well. "So you know," I whispered. He nodded once. "Yes, I know what it feels like when the people who should love you become the architects of your fear." The words wrapped around me, and for the first time since the turbulence began, I felt my breathing begin to slow. My father's curse still pulsed in the back of my mind, but Ethan's voice made it sound less absolute, less binding. I found myself speaking more freely, the words tumbling out between shaky breaths. I told him about Gerald and Marianne, about the way they adored Daniel while treating me like a burden, about the years of small, sharp cuts that built into scars I carried invisibly every day. I confessed that sometimes I wondered if I was invisible to them altogether, except when they needed someone to blame. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for details or try to fix it. He simply let me speak, and that was more healing than any comfort I'd ever known. The plane dipped once more, just enough to remind me of the curse I carried, but this time I didn't clutch the armrests as tightly. Ethan's presence kept me grounded in a way that surprised me. There was something mysterious in his timing, in the way he appeared exactly when I was falling apart. But for now I didn't care. For now, in the shaking skies and the memories of cruelty, I had found someone who understood, and that understanding was enough to keep me from breaking completely. For the first time in years, I let someone else hold a piece of my truth. I was 9 the first time I realized I wasn't just unloved, I was unwanted. The memory struck me now, mid-flight, as if turbulence had shaken it loose from the locked drawer where I tried to bury it. I remembered standing at the top of the staircase, bare feet cold against the wood, listening to my parents argue in the kitchen below. The house smelled of whiskey and burnt toast, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I couldn't sleep. Their voices were daggers cutting through the night. And then I heard it, clear and sharp. She was a mistake, Marianne. I never wanted her. Those words pierced me in a way no child should ever endure. My small hands clutched the railing as though it could anchor me, but I felt myself unraveling from the inside out. A mistake. Not a daughter, not a blessing, not even a neutral presence, but an accident, a regret. I could still hear my mother's silence, that awful silence that felt like agreement. She didn't protest, didn't argue, didn't defend me. She simply let his words linger in the air like smoke, choking me even though I was 2 floors above them. That night, something inside me shattered, and I learned what it meant to be a shadow in my own family. Daniel, of course, was the opposite. He was their son, their golden boy, the one who could spill juice on the white carpet and still be met with laughter instead of scolding. He was praised for every minor accomplishment, a drawing stuck to the fridge, a goal scored in a backyard game. I, on the other hand, could come home with perfect grades, with trophies I'd fought tooth and nail to earn, and all I'd get was a nod or a distracted hum. The comparison wasn't even subtle. It was an open wound kept raw by their indifference, by their insistence that Daniel was the miracle, and I was the mistake they tolerated. I remembered one birthday in particular, my 12th. Daniel had just turned 15, and my parents had thrown him a lavish party, complete with balloons, music, and half the neighborhood invited. 3 weeks later, on my birthday, my cake was bought from the discount section of the grocery store, its frosting slightly melted, its candles reused. They didn't even bother to wrap the single gift they gave me. Daniel got a bike. I got a sweater too big for my frame, probably something my mother had picked off a clearance rack. That was the year I stopped pretending birthdays meant anything. As the plane hummed around me now, I realized how deep those roots of rejection had grown. They weren't just memories. They had shaped every decision, every wall I had built, every attempt I'd made to prove that I was worth existing. It wasn't about the duplex, or the independence, or even the dreams I pursued. It was about defying the sentence my father had cast over me when I was 9. She was a mistake. Those words had followed me into adulthood, gnawed at me in every quiet moment. A family curse whispered into my ear whenever I dared to believe I deserved love. I shifted in my seat, swallowing the lump in my throat as Ethan's earlier words replayed. They don't control you unless you let them. Could it really be that simple? Could I sever the chains of a curse woven through my childhood with a decision, with sheer will? Part of me wanted to believe it, but another part, the little girl on the staircase, still trembled, still heard Gerald's voice every time I tried to silence it. Some wounds didn't heal. They calcified into the bones, becoming part of who you were whether you wanted them to or not. And yet, another memory rose, one I hadn't let myself visit in years. I remembered whispering to Daniel once, during one of our rare moments alone, asking if he knew I was unwanted. He had looked at me with confusion, almost pity, and said, "Dad just gets angry. Don't take it seriously." But even then, I knew he didn't understand. He was never called a mistake. He was never told without words that his life was an inconvenience. He was always celebrated, never cursed. That difference was everything. It wasn't anger. It was truth, spoken aloud when they thought I couldn't hear. The plane dipped slightly again, and I closed my eyes, gripping the memory tightly. Maybe that was the curse my father cast, long before he ever spat venom at the airport. Not just wishing me harm, but planting the seed that my life had no rightful place. And maybe, just maybe, surviving, thriving, choosing to exist boldly despite him, was the only way to break it. Still, the wound burned. Still, the word mistake curled inside me like a hidden brand. And as I sat there, high above the clouds, I realized the turbulence in my chest wasn't from the plane alone. It was from carrying a lifetime of shadows I wasn't sure how to set down. Ethan leaned slightly closer, as though my confession had unlocked something in him, his eyes calm, but piercing. "Your father," he began, almost casually. "He's in finance, isn't he? Gerald. Cold man, always looking at numbers, never people." My breath froze. I hadn't spoken my father's name, nor his profession. The words felt like a spotlight suddenly trained on me, exposing every secret I had carried into this cabin. My mind scrambled for explanations, any rational thread to cling to, but none held. The plane's engines roared faintly louder in the background, and for the first time, the stranger at my side didn't feel like comfort. He felt like a mirror I hadn't asked for. I tried to laugh, to push it off as coincidence. "Lots of fathers work in finance," I muttered, forcing a brittle smile, though the muscles in my face felt foreign. But Ethan didn't smile back. He just tilted his head, studying me with unnerving patience. "And your brother, Daniel," he added softly, almost like a lullaby. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I thought it might shatter them. I had never once mentioned Daniel's name. Not to him, not to anyone on this plane. How do you know that?" I whispered, my voice breaking into a dry rasp. The turbulence hit then, sudden and sharp, as if the very air around us had reacted to my fear. The plane jolted, overhead bins rattling, passengers gasping in unison. My tray table quivered, my water sloshing over the rim of its plastic cup, staining my jeans with cold. But I hardly noticed. My entire body was numb, every nerve rooted in the impossible truth that this man knew more about me than I had given him. The word mistake, my father's curse, and now this stranger's quiet knowledge tangled together until I couldn't tell which was more terrifying. Ethan didn't flinch at the turbulence. His composure was almost inhuman, as though he had been expecting it. His hand rested near mine on the armrest, steady, firm, as if he belonged here in a way no one else did. "Alexia," he said, my name rolling from his lips like he had said it 1,000 times before, practiced, known. I felt as though the plane itself had tilted into freefall. He hadn't asked my name. I hadn't given it, and yet, there it was, spoken with chilling certainty, undeniable. "What do you want from me?" I snapped, but my voice was brittle, breaking under the weight of dread. He leaned closer still, the hum of the engines nearly swallowing his words, but I caught them all the same. "I want you to understand that you're not alone. You never have been." The meaning twisted in my chest, a knife coated in honey. Not alone. The words should have soothed me, but instead, they burned, because coming from him, they felt less like comfort and more like surveillance, like someone had been watching me far longer than this flight. I pulled back, pressing against the window, but there was nowhere to run. Just sky, and this man who seemed to know the architecture of my life. The passengers around us were blissfully ignorant, flipping through magazines, sipping sodas, clutching armrests in the storm of turbulence. But my storm was sharper, more insidious. Each word from Ethan was another bolt of lightning splitting open my past, illuminating corners I had tried to keep dark. He smiled faintly, and in the flicker of the overhead light, I swore I saw pity in his eyes. Not malice, not smugness, but pity. Somehow that was worse. Why would a stranger pity me unless he carried truths I hadn't faced, unless he knew endings I hadn't imagined? I tried to focus on the rational, to pin his knowledge on coincidence, on some trick of observation. Maybe he had overheard something at the gate. Maybe I had slipped a name without realizing. But no, I replayed every second in my mind. I hadn't. He shouldn't know. He couldn't know. The plane rattled again, a deep lurch that made a child cry in the row ahead. My pulse beat louder than the engines, louder than the captain's muffled reassurance over the intercom. A thought began to form in my chest, wild and unspoken. What if this wasn't a coincidence at all? What if Ethan wasn't meant to be a stranger? The dread sat heavier with each passing second, pressing down like the cabin air had thinned. Ethan's eyes never wavered from mine, and for the first time since boarding, I wished for distance, wished for solitude. The plane might have been full of bodies, but right then, it was only him and me, predator and prey, knower and known. My father's curse echoed in my mind. I hope this plane crashes. And for a terrifying moment, I wondered if Ethan was the hand delivering it, or worse, if he was here not to harm me, but to reveal something that would make the crash inside me inevitable. The turbulence eased into a soft rocking, but my chest was still rattling as though the storm had moved inside me. Ethan leaned back in his seat, folding his hands slowly, like a priest preparing to deliver penance. His eyes softened, though the weight behind them grew heavier, almost unbearable. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and deliberate, the tone of a man stepping into a confession he had long avoided. "I've known your family before, long before today, and sitting here with you, it feels less like chance and more like something unfinished. His words struck like an earthquake. Everything I thought I knew began to crack. My throat tightened. "What do you mean you knew them?" I demanded, though the question shook with fear more than anger. The possibility made me recoil, yet my body leaned closer, unable to resist the pull of his truth. Ethan's gaze dropped, almost as if ashamed, and for the first time since we'd spoken, he seemed humanly fragile. "Gerald," he whispered, my father's name like poison between us. "Your father. He destroyed me." I felt my insides collapse, the words dragging me down like an undertow. Ethan didn't speak as a stranger anymore. He spoke as someone marked, scarred by the same man who had carved wounds into my life. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tense. Years ago, I trusted him. I believed in him. He promised opportunity, a future. I gave him everything, my savings, my loyalty, my time. But your father saw me as disposable. He took what he wanted, left me stripped of everything, and walked away without a glance back. His words carried no exaggeration, no need for embellishment. They dripped with a pain so precise, so lived in, that I couldn't deny them. My father, the man who had sneered at me at the gate, had left another life in ruins long before mine. The plane shifted slightly, a reminder that the sky still held us, fragile as paper, but my world was shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with turbulence. I lost my home, my fiancé, my career, Ethan continued, his eyes distant, as if reliving each loss in sequence. I begged him to make it right. He refused, said I was reckless, irresponsible, words that echoed because he knew they would cut deepest. He spoke like a man condemning me to oblivion, and I went there, Alexia, oblivion, years of it. His voice cracked then, just a fraction, enough to prove this wasn't performance. This was scar tissue. Tears stung at my eyes before I could stop them. My whole life, I had carried the weight of not being enough for my parents, of being invisible beside Daniel, of feeling cursed from the very beginning. But now I realized something even crueler. My suffering was not only mine. My family's cruelty had been a plague, spreading outward, claiming others, shattering lives beyond our walls. Ethan wasn't a ghost from nowhere. He was a casualty of the same storm that had raised me. My stomach twisted with guilt, though none of it was my crime. And yet, in his eyes, I saw my family's fingerprints on his ruin. "Why are you telling me this now?" I whispered, my voice breaking into the hum of the engines. Ethan turned to me then, his eyes glassy but sharp, cutting through my trembling composure. "Because when I saw you, I recognized something in your face. The same wounds your father carved into me, he carved into you. Different methods, same intent. To break, to belittle, to take." His hand trembled slightly as he placed it over his heart. "And fate, or whatever cruel force guides us, sat me beside the daughter of the man who stole everything. I couldn't keep silent anymore. The words dug into me, sharper than any insult my father had ever thrown. I thought of Gerald's coldness, of Marianne's silence, of Daniel's smug reign over my childhood. They had carved me into someone desperate for freedom, desperate for proof that I mattered. But Ethan's confession unveiled something darker. I had been carrying not just my family's neglect, but the echoes of their sins against others. The inheritance of pain was larger than I'd imagined, spanning beyond blood, beyond generations. I was not just unloved, I was a symbol of the harm they left behind. I shook my head, my voice barely holding. "I didn't know. I didn't know what he did to you." Ethan nodded gently, his expression softer now, as if my ignorance was the only innocence I had left. "I believe you," he said, his tone steadier, almost kind. "You've been punished enough for their cruelty. I see it in the way you sit, in the way you carry yourself, braced for blows that never stop coming. You've been bearing their sins without even knowing it." His words weren't accusation, they were release. But still, I felt the chains of their actions heavy on my chest, binding me to a legacy I never chose. The plane's lights dimmed slightly, the cabin quieting for night, but inside me the storm was only beginning. I stared at Ethan, the stranger who wasn't truly a stranger, the man my father had broken and abandoned, and I realized, with a cold certainty, that this flight was never just about leaving home or starting over. It was about inheritance, not of wealth, not of love, but of sins. My father's curse had lived long before he spoke it at the gate, and now it sat beside me, flesh and blood, looking me in the eye. The first jolt came like a violent shove, a hand from the heavens tipping the plane sideways. Gasps erupted through the cabin, followed by the shrill sound of a child crying 2 rows behind me. Trays clattered to the floor, cups spilled, and a wave of dread spread like fire. The second jolt was worse, dragging the aircraft downward with a gut-wrenching dip that tore screams from the passengers' throats. Then came the hiss, a sound that pierced every ear. The oxygen masks dropped, dangling like pale ghosts in the dim cabin. My heart pounded in my throat, raw and merciless, as if it would explode. The plane shuddered violently again, lights flickering as though struggling to stay alive. A woman near the aisle was sobbing uncontrollably, her husband clutching her head against his chest. An older man fumbled with his mask, his hands trembling so badly that he dropped it twice before a flight attendant steadied him. Chaos swallowed order, each scream and prayer weaving into the roaring engines that now felt less like machines and more like a beast devouring us whole. I froze, paralyzed, as fear reached inside me, dragging out my father's voice. I hope this plane crashes. Ethan's hand found mine, firm, grounding, though his grip carried more than comfort. It carried possession, insistence. His eyes locked on mine, blazing not with fear, but with something disturbingly close to satisfaction. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the mayhem. "This is justice, Alexia. Fate doesn't make mistakes. The words your father spat have weight, and maybe this is the answer." His lips trembled, not with terror but with a grim exhilaration, as if the storm outside had been conjured just for us. My lungs burned as I pulled the oxygen mask down, fumbling, almost forgetting how to breathe. The air tasted metallic, dry, like survival itself rationed by a thin tube. Yet Ethan refused his own mask, staring at me instead, as though inhaling my fear was enough to sustain him. "I begged for closure for years," he continued, voice rough, pressing closer despite the shaking of the plane. "And now, here you are, Gerald's daughter, beside me when the sky itself rips open. Don't you see the poetry? Don't you feel the symmetry?" His words struck like lightning, both terrifying and magnetic. The plane dropped again, a terrifying plunge that drew a chorus of screams, a cabin-wide prayer stitched by desperation. My stomach lurched, my bones rattled, and for one brutal second I thought gravity had claimed us. Yet through the chaos, Ethan held my gaze. His eyes shone with a feverish conviction, and I realized with horror that he wasn't afraid of dying. He welcomed it. To him, this wasn't tragedy. It was an execution of fate, and he wanted me to feel it, to share in the twisted justice carved out by sky and curse. But I wasn't ready to surrender to his vision. The thought of dying here, beneath the weight of my father's cruelty, made my chest burn with defiance. "I don't deserve this!" I shouted, though my voice was swallowed by the roar of the engines and the panicked cries. Ethan's fingers dug tighter into my hand, almost painfully. "Don't you?" he hissed, not with malice but with an unnerving intensity. "You've carried his sins all your life, Alexia. Maybe this is the way the world burns them clean. Maybe this is how both of us are freed." His words felt like shackles, binding me to a fate I couldn't accept. Another violent shudder shook the plane, oxygen masks swinging wildly, flight attendants clutching the backs of seats as they stumbled through the aisle. Somewhere behind me, a voice cried out the Lord's Prayer, each line desperate, fragmented by sobs. My body trembled, but something inside me cracked open, a refusal that surged stronger than fear. My father's curse might have poisoned the air I breathed, but I would not let his voice dictate how I lived or how I died. I yanked my hand free of Ethan's grip, the motion small but defiant, breaking the spell of his conviction. For the first time, his face faltered, confusion flickering across the rigid mask of certainty. He looked at me as though I had defied the very laws of fate, as though my refusal had broken some unspoken pact between us. The plane still trembled, the storm still howled, but my heart steadied in that moment. I had lived my whole life under the weight of their cruelty, silent and bowed. Not anymore. If the sky wanted to claim me, it would do so on my terms, not as a continuation of Gerald's venom or Ethan's obsession. For the first time, I felt alive in the face of death. The storm seemed to loosen its grip, just as suddenly as it had seized us. The violent dips softened into shivers, the cabin no longer a cage of screams but a chamber of ragged breaths and muffled sobs. The oxygen masks swung with less violence now, their movement slower, as though the plane itself were recovering from a seizure. Passengers clung to one another, still trapped in the echo of terror, while flight attendants whispered reassurance they themselves did not fully believe. I pulled the mask from my face, chest heaving, my lungs aching for something more than air, for answers, for clarity. The reprieve was deceptive, a fragile calm stretched thin, but my mind spiraled faster than the engines. Ethan still hadn't looked away from me. His face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, but his expression remained disturbingly composed, like someone watching a storm he had long predicted. "Alexia," he said, voice low, threading through the cabin noise. "You've been running from ghosts you didn't even know were yours." His eyes darkened. Sorrow and fury coiled together. "Your father destroyed me. Not just me, my family, my bloodline, my chance at a future. And you wonder why you've always carried his shadow? It was never you. It was the debt of his sins hanging over your life like a curse." My stomach twisted, the turbulence inside me worse than anything the sky could inflict. I shook my head, whispering, "No, I didn't do anything." The words tumbled out raw, like a child's plea for innocence. Ethan leaned closer, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "I know you didn't. You were just a girl. You didn't choose him. You didn't choose any of this. But Gerald, your father, he stole from me. Money, reputation, everything. He left me in ruins. I was younger than you are now when it happened. My father never recovered. My mother died believing we were cursed. And I've been crawling through ashes ever since." His hand trembled as he pressed it to his chest. I could barely process his words, but they fell into me like shards finding old wounds. Suddenly, memories aligned. The disdain in Gerald's eyes, Marianne's silence, Daniel's undeserved pedestal. Their cruelty toward me had always felt inexplicable, senseless, like punishment for existing. But Ethan's confession twisted the knife into understanding. Maybe I had never been just unwanted. Maybe I was a living reminder, a mirror of the destruction Gerald had caused. Every look of disdain was not just about me. It was about the echo of the man my father had wronged. I was their constant reminder that choices have consequences, even if the guilty refuse to bear them. The cabin light steadied above us, but my world remained fractured. I pressed my palms against my knees, my whole body shaking with the realization. My parents hadn't just rejected me out of preference for Daniel. They had despised me because I symbolized their shame, the living evidence of sins they could never erase. Ethan's eyes glistened, his voice a mix of accusation and mercy. "You think they hated you for being weak, Alexia? No, they hated you because you reminded them of their own weakness, of what they cost others. You are proof they cannot escape their own cruelty, and they punished you for it." Tears burned my eyes, though I tried to blink them back. The truth was heavier than hate. It was history dragging me into its depths, even though I had never written its chapters. "All this time," I whispered, barely audible. Ethan nodded slowly, almost tenderly now. "All this time, you were carrying sins that weren't yours to carry. You were punished for a crime you never committed." His words softened, but the weight of them crushed me. I felt split open, every scar of childhood illuminated by this revelation. I wasn't unwanted because of who I was. I was unwanted because of what they had done. The engines hummed, steadier now, as though mocking the chaos unraveling in my chest. Around us, passengers adjusted their masks, whispering prayers of gratitude that the storm had passed. But I couldn't feel relief. My storm had only just begun. My life, every rejection, every moment of silence, every cruel word, suddenly had a thread binding them together, and it all led back to Gerald. My father's sins had sentenced me to a life of exile in my own home, and the worst part was realizing that on some level, I had believed their lie, that I deserved it. Ethan's hand hovered near mine again, not forceful this time, but almost offering. His eyes searched me, not with triumph, but with exhaustion, as though finally confessing the truth had cost him pieces of himself. "I needed you to know," he whispered, "before this plane touches the ground, or before it doesn't. You needed to know you were never the mistake." They were. His voice trembled now, breaking through the armor of conviction. And for the first time, I saw the man beneath his obsession, broken, battered, desperate to release a truth that had caged him just as it had caged me. The plane's wheels kissed the tarmac with a jolt, the vibrations coursing through my body, leaving me trembling yet strangely lighter. Passengers erupted in nervous applause, a sound that felt distant to me, as if it belonged to a world I no longer inhabited. I inhaled the cabin air, rich with recycled oxygen and relief, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight pressing on my chest loosen, just enough to imagine breathing freely. Ethan offered a brief, almost imperceptible smile before stepping back, blending into the crowd with a quiet dignity that left me wondering if he had ever been real. My hands, still shaking from turbulence and revelations, gripped the armrests, grounding me, reminding me that I had survived, not just the storm outside, but the one within me. The terminal lights reflected off the windows like distant stars, mirroring the chaos of emotions dancing across my mind. Fear had transformed into clarity. The lies my parents fed me could no longer claim dominion over my soul. I walked through the jetway with a slow, deliberate pace, every step feeling like a declaration of my own independence. The murmurs of passengers faded behind me as I passed into the fluorescent-lit terminal, a place where ordinary people reclaimed their lives from the skies. I thought about Gerald and Marianne, their coldness, the venomous words they had spat at me before I even boarded. The memory of their eyes, gleaming with malice as I stepped onto that plane, seared my mind. And yet, paradoxically, it empowered me. For decades, I had carried the invisible chains of their rejection, the invisible scars of being the unwanted child, the burden of a curse I had never deserved. Today, for the first time, I understood that the curse had never belonged to me. It had always been theirs. I thought of Ethan, who had shared truths I could not have imagined hearing, truths that had torn open the fabric of my past while illuminating the path forward. He had not been cruel or vindictive. He had simply been a mirror, showing me the reality I had refused to face. My parents' hatred had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with their failures and greed. I clenched my fists, feeling both anger and liberation, the fire of injustice tempered by the relief of understanding. I realized that I could forgive myself for the years of self-blame, for believing that their malice was my reflection, and for letting silence and doubt fester in my heart. I was no longer a prisoner of their choices. I was free to chart a life of my own making. Outside, the humid afternoon air wrapped around me, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and distant rain. I paused, watching travelers reunite with loved ones, the mundane humanity around me striking a deep contrast to the extraordinary upheaval in my heart. I knew that, despite the calm, life was fragile. Moments of joy could be shattered in an instant, a truth the flight had hammered into me with brutal precision. And yet fragility did not mean weakness. It meant awareness, vigilance, and gratitude. Every step I took away from the terminal was a small triumph over the years of neglect, over the words that had tried to define me, over the invisible chains Gerald and Marianne had attempted to wrap around my life. I walked with purpose, my head held high, a survivor of both storm and family cruelty. I did not glance back at the jetway or the planes lining the tarmac. There was no need. I had left behind not just the turbulence of the sky, but the turbulence of a family that had never wanted me. I had spent too long seeking their approval, chasing the phantom of love they could never provide. Today, I chose myself, my own judgment, my own heart as the measure of worth. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat of resolve, each breath a quiet testament to resilience. The pain of childhood rejection and parental disdain still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. It was a relic, a lesson, a fuel to propel me into my own life. Then the news came like a cruel punctuation mark, a moment of almost cinematic irony that would forever mark the day. As I rounded a corner in the airport terminal, a commotion rose near the newsstand, whispers spreading like wildfire. Gerald and Marianne had been in a car accident on the highway, minutes away from the airport. While driving home, the details were sketchy, the sirens faint in the distance of my mind, but the implication was immediate and undeniable. The words my father had uttered, the poison in his heart, had seemed like a curse toward me. Yet now, in an almost poetic twist of fate, that same bitterness had shaped their own endangerment. The universe had an odd sense of justice, impartial yet precise. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the terminal wash over me, letting the gravity of the irony settle. They had cursed me with words, with coldness, with cruelty, believing that their disdain could shape my fate. Instead, it had boomeranged in the quietest, most profound way, sparing me, leaving me alive, aware, and stronger than ever. I felt no schadenfreude, only a solemn recognition of life's fragility and the responsibility to embrace it fully. I had survived the storm, the turbulence, the lies, and the hatred. And now, with the knowledge of both my parents' malice and the miracle of my own endurance, I could finally step into the life I was meant to live, unshackled from old fears. Ethan's presence faded into memory, his lessons lingering like a warm glow. I thought about the power of truth, the strength in facing fear, and the liberation in acknowledging reality without flinching. My parents' words had sought to destroy me, but instead, they had only clarified who I was and what I valued. I was resilient, I was intelligent, I was capable, and most importantly, I belonged to myself. The world outside awaited, vast and uncertain, but I no longer feared it. I walked with purpose, a survivor in every sense, carrying not anger but clarity, a life rewritten in the moment between landing and revelation. By the time I reached the curb, sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the wet asphalt like a signal. I could see the blur of emergency vehicles on the distant highway, the faint echoes of fate, aligning in strange, immutable patterns. I did not look back at the scene. I had no desire to witness the aftermath personally. The plane had delivered me not only to land, but to liberation. The curse that Gerald had wielded so cruelly over me had found its mirror, leaving me intact, clear-eyed, and finally unburdened. I took a deep breath, the first fully mine in decades, and stepped forward into a future where fear no longer dictated my steps. My life, my choices, and my resilience were finally my own.